Thanks, and I just want to say that was a great talk we just heard by Stacy. I'm going to talk today about the results of a sort of framework for predictability assessment applied to basins around the country. It's a long name, Variational Ensemble Streamflow Prediction Assessment, or VESPA for short, and I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, Tom Hopson, Andy Newman, and Martin Clark, who are at NCAR, as well as Levi Brekke and Jeff Arnold, who work in water management agencies that have been supporting the work. Let's see. Do I have? Okay. Too many keyboards up here. Okay, so the basic underlying concepts behind the talk are when you're looking at streamflow predictions on really any scale, some of the dominance, you can categorize the dominant sources of skill in two ways. One is kind of the hydrologic predictability that resides in the watershed, the fact that the watershed has stored up moisture in the form of soil moisture or snow, and that's captured by the monitoring network, measurements of streamflow, accumulated precipitation, snowpack, and the quality of the model that you're using to represent the basin. And the second is atmospheric predictability, basically how well we can forecast the weather and climate. And these two sources sort of interact and vary both in space and time, and the way that they vary sort of controls the opportunities that we have for harnessing predictability in streamflow for water management purposes. So in some areas we hope to harness it through better climate predictions, in other areas through better monitoring, and I'll sort of illustrate this as I go forward. To do this study, we have set up a set of models for 762 catchments around the U.S. They're taken from the HCDN, or Gauges 2 HCDN network, so they're relatively unimpaired. They kind of span the CONUS, but they're more in better monitored places like the West Coast and the eastern U.S. and fewer in the northern Great Plains. But our calibrated models so we went through optimization approach to calibrate these models, Snow 17 and SAC. We got good results in most locations. I'm going to focus in this talk just on contrasting two watersheds. One is in the humid sort of eastern U.S., the Chattooga Basin, and this just shows an illustration of how the model calibrates when you use the SE. And this is with day-met forcings, daily timescale. Second is a snowy western U.S. basin. This is the Crystal River, and it tends to be much colder, and here we also have a good calibration. And just to illustrate the difference in that temperature and moisture cycle makes in the seasonal cycle of the hydrologic sort of moisture budget, I plotted up the kind of calendar year on average of precipitation, soil moisture, runoff, and in the case of the Crystal River, the snow. I don't show the evapotranspiration, which is another flux, but you can see that in the Chattooga River, there is a bit of seasonal cycle. It's driven mainly by evaporation in the summer, which draws down soil moisture and runoff. Whereas in the Crystal River Basin, there's a really pronounced cycle that many are familiar with, people who live in snowy regimes, where you build up basically all the precipitation in the winter, turns into snowpack, and slowly the soil moisture kind of drains out under the snow at a slow rate, and then once summer arrives or spring arrives, there's a pretty rapid melt. It elevates soil moisture, and then that helps elevate runoff, and eventually evaporation kind of cuts in to the this flux and drives the runoff back down. And then it repeats again the following year. So a way to kind of assess the influence of these variations on predictability and streamflow is to use sort of an elaboration of our ensemble prediction approach, the ESP that's been used in the National Weather Service. And ESP you can think of as, for those who don't know what ESP is, you start off by spinning up a hydrologic model to the current condition, just assuming the model has sort of a perfect estimate of that state, and then running it forward with climatological forecasts, so basically traces from history, which is essentially saying that you know nothing about the future weather and climate. And in practice, this is not exactly how it's done. There is a weather forecast that's put in for the first few days. But this can be compared to climatology. And so you can sort of, through this comparison, see the influence of uncertainty in the climate, where you say, I don't know anything about the future, on uncertainty in the streamflow forecast. And conversely, you could also say it's a way of measuring initial condition skill versus not knowing anything in your initial conditions. And a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6, I contrasted this with a sort of a reverse of that approach, where you put all the uncertainty in the initial condition and force the model with perfect meteorology, so you can see the influence of uncertainty in the initial conditions going out through the forecast period. More recently, so these sort of represent 2 endpoints of perfect knowledge and no knowledge in different components of the different sources of forecast skill. So more recently, excuse me, we've done a study where we combine these and we vary, rather than just going for perfect knowledge or no knowledge, we look at all different gradations in between in both sources of skill at the same time. So this is this VESPA forecast approach, where you can look at sort of half knowledge of initial conditions, or 10% uncertainty in initial conditions, coupled with, say, 95% uncertainty versus climatology and future climate, which is actually a reasonable approach. You know initial conditions in hydrologic forecast probably somewhat well if your model's okay, but you still don't know much about future climate forecasts. And maybe with considering things like ENSO, you end up with a little bit more knowledge. Maybe you actually have, I don't know, 5 or 10% skill over climatology from the ENSO or other like climate state indicators. So that would be sort of a reasonable approximation. So when you put these all together, and basically doing this for 424 basins for 30-year hindcasts with 30-member ensembles, I think I ran 450 million simulations on NCAR's Yellowstone computer, 30-year simulations. So it's not for the faint of heart, but certainly if you're interested in just one single catchment, the sort of lifting on the data side is a lot lower. In any case, so if you look at what you can get out of looking at these various gradations of skill, is contour plots of the seasonal forecast skill. So let's see if this pointer works. So basically the colors are R-squareds for seasonal forecast skill for a 3-month lead forecast. And along the bottom axis, you have sort of a fraction of uncertainty for the initial hydrologic conditions, basically how well your model captures initial state. And on this axis, it's the same thing, but for seasonal climate forecasts. And you can see that at some times of year, just given the way this cycle works, you have essentially no sensitivity in streamflow forecast skill to climate forecast skill. All the sensitivity is along the initial hydrologic condition axis. And that's because, say you're in December here, you look for the next 3 months, and really the runoff is just flat. It's basically that snow accumulation period. So the only thing that's going to determine the runoff is basically how much is in soil moisture. All the meteorology is just turning into snow. But as you move forward to the point where you start to melt, then climate becomes sort of more critical. So basically into May and June, where you start to have a rise of the hydrograph. At this point, initial conditions are a little bit important, but the way the meteorology, the forcings on the basins occur, if it's warm, if it's cold, if you get more rain or you don't get any rain, that actually influences the variation in runoff. And then once you get to this going into the dry season, you end up with the initial conditions again, like down here, April, May, and throughout until it starts raining again in the fall. they completely, again, determine the sensitivity. So, and you can look at this, so we looked at this for various periods. That was 3 months. This is 1 month. In 1 month, you see a lot more months where the initial conditions basically dominate because seasonal climate doesn't have enough time to really act on the basin, though there are a few months right during this melt period again where climate's important. And if you look at a longer period like 6 months, here you see there are more cases where you have an influence of this climate forecast, so there's some movement in the skill as you go up this dimension. If we contrast this with a humid basin, our Chattooga Basin, in every month, so for a 3-month runoff forecast, these gradients show that the initial conditions and the seasonal climate forecast both sort of blend to control the streamflow forecast skill. And another thing you can do with this kind of analysis is to calculate skill elasticities for streamflow forecasts. So if we look at one of these plots, what we're basically talking about is for a given point, like say the ESP point where we have pretty low initial condition uncertainty, but it's not perfect, and pretty low or pretty high uncertainty in the climate forecast, but not completely climatological, maybe a little skill. Around that point, the derivatives of skill, of flow forecast skill with respect to each axis give us elasticity. So as you go up and down this direction, you're contrasting flow skill versus seasonal climate skill changes. And if you go in the other direction, you're contrasting initial flow skill with initial condition skill. And so these are basically elasticities. And to be honest, I haven't seen this concept applied to streamflow forecasting or even really weather and climate forecasting. But it's basically a kind of sensitivity analysis. We can then map these for all our points across the country, and it's kind of interesting to see where in different regions of the country you have different sort of patterns of dominance for the source of skill for streamflow prediction. So in the Intermountain West, where it's kind of dry and cold, you have a strong seasonal cycle. We actually tend to mostly see that initial conditions, so over here, let's see, sensitivities or elasticities with respect to initial conditions are very high pretty much throughout the year. And then over here in the seasonal climate forecast column at different times of year, initializing forecast, October, January, April, and July, you tend to see that there's some really high elasticities along the coast. That's where climate forecasts actually, they're higher than 1. So that says for like a 5% increase in climate forecast skill, you might get a 15 or 20% increase in streamflow forecast skill. So that's actually kind of remarkable because what it says is that if we're just going to evaluate sort of a source of climate forecast, we might want to factor in the influence it has over our streamflow forecast skill and the sort of common wisdom that, oh, you know, precipitation forecasts for climate are really low skilled, 5 to 10% skill. That's not really useful. Well, it might actually be useful in some of these basins where that actually has an elasticity of more than 1. So that's my last slide. I'll just summarize and say we just introduced this approach for assessing seasonal flow forecast skill dependency. It goes beyond this earlier sort of ESP, reverse ESP construct that really just provide the endpoints. We get this calculation of skill elasticities, which I think is a new concept for us. And so it's a tool for understanding where you want to invest in streamflow forecast improvements. For a certain kind of forecast, say a 1-month forecast in spring, do you need better models or do you need better climate forecasts? And it varies. And so that's pretty much my talk. Oh, we did, and so this 424 basin assessment, a lot of the results will be on the web. Some of the links to look at are these. I'll just acknowledge the Corps and Bureau for support. Thanks.